We will go ahead and get started. Jen, if you'd like to begin your presentation, then feel free.
Okay. I'm going to talk today about teaching photovoltaics, and this is teaching photovoltaics as a class and not part of another class. So I'll go through some definitions, a little bit of an introduction, some words about class length, some of the challenges that I face trying to find textbooks. Um, I'll go into some detail about how homework and tests and projects were handled. And I'll also give you some links and some ideas as to some support material that you can use when you're teaching. So when I talk about a class versus a seminar or a colloquium, a class, as I think of it, meets for multiple sessions over a period of weeks. There's an assigned textbook or textbooks with assigned reading. You have assigned homework problems. There are quizzes and tests, and the whole thing culminates in a grade of some sort, resulting in credit towards a degree or certificate. A seminar or a tutorial is something I think of as being much shorter, a partial day or maybe 2 days at the max, where there's no assigned textbook, there's very little problem solving, no quiz, and it's generally not for credit towards a degree. A colloquium is really an hour. It's not very long. It's mostly an informal introduction, and there's really not a lot of detail about the subject. So my experience is I first taught as a TA and grad student, like many of us do. And then as a postdoc, I taught general physics for scientists and engineers. When I went to the University of Wyoming, they wanted to start a class in the School of Energy Resources, which focused on solar energy conversion. And this was a new class. We had to write it from scratch, and I co-taught it with Professor Bruce Parkinson. We made the class so that it required general chemistry and general engineering physics because we wanted the students to understand a little bit about the materials we were talking about, but also about how electric circuits work. The students were upper level undergrads in chemistry and graduates in engineering, which weren't the students that we originally focused the class for. The class was originally focused for students of the School of Energy Resources, and what those students do is they spec out industrial power supplies or arrays. So it was kind of interesting. I wrote the class and then had to go back and rewrite the class because my students were a different level than I originally intended. Now the first half of this class, which went for a semester or 15 weeks, was solar thermal, and the second half was photovoltaics. So in the solar thermal part, we talked about concentrator solar, and then in the second half it was all photovoltaics where we're direct energy conversion from photons. And one thing you need to think about when you're setting up a class in photovoltaics is how many days or weeks is your class scheduled for, because that really helps you decide what you're going to teach. You are only going to have so much time, and you have to lay out a framework for what you want to cover, and realizing that some concepts take multiple lectures, but you can combine others. It becomes a very flexible thing. You can't have a real rigid structure, especially when you have people that do not have a background in photovoltaics or in solid state physics or solid chemistry. You have to decide how long each lecture will be. Are you teaching 2 days a week, 3 days a week? And that actually played a lot into how we graded the class. So, you have to decide what you want your students to take away. For example, if your class is more focused on installing utility scale arrays, do you really want to spend 4 weeks teaching your students about p-n junctions? And if you want your class to be more focused on the science side and the technology and how it works and why it works, how long do you want to spend on teaching the students about laws and um, of how to install an array and all the things that go along with that. So uh, one thing we did in Wyoming that worked really well and something to consider was to weight the homework. So the class length was an hour and a half twice a week, but in order to keep the students involved and up to date, it became pretty obvious that if we made the homework worth something, they were going to actually do it. So the homework was actually worth 30% of the grade, and I actually had the students do required readings each week also because they needed to do it in order to do the assignment. Class attendance was actually pretty good. We set it up. We set out the agenda or the syllabus. The students looked it over, and I think they realized early on that learning something that's outside your degree, you have to go to class. I tried to make my lectures interesting. Um, and one thing that we did was for the photovoltaic part of the class was the groups. There was a final group project that was worth 25% of the grade. And these were groups that I chose. I assigned them. They had to research a utility scale installation, and they had to present a group project, and each member of the group had to get up and speak, and they had to consider the environmental impact, licensing, permitting, the political angst, if there was any, and then they had to give the technical information about this utility. What was the power output? How many days did it run? What technology was employed? And it was a pretty intense project. They actually worked very hard on it. We tried to make it straightforward, but unfortunately, some of that stuff isn't all that straightforward, and it's not that easy to ferret out. Another thing to consider was the level of the class and how difficult we wanted to make it. So, if you have a 100 level, it's really introductory. You're not going to have a calculus. It's going to be very basic. 200 level is a bit more challenging. And then, of course, the 300 and up, that's why we had prior requirements, because we wanted to make it a little more challenging. We wanted to be able to include some science as well as the technical or the installation side of it. So when choosing lecture subjects, I had to really choose how I wanted to present this because my students were from very varied backgrounds. They did have general physics and they did have general chemistry, but they didn't have solid state physics, and they didn't have a lot of a lot of them didn't have a lot of experience with circuit design or understanding how power's collected through even a battery. So we had to go through some really basic stuff to start. Teaching science to non-scientists and teaching physics to non-physicists, teaching chemistry to non-chemists, etc. It requires saying the same thing in different ways. So I would present a topic, and then I would ask my students directly if they had questions. And often, you can hear crickets. They don't always respond. But I would start the next lecture by going over the previous lecture briefly. And it was at that time that when they had some time to think about things a little bit, then we would have some questions and some discussions. So remember that inexperience is in no way a lack of intelligence. And often when people are presented with new concepts that they've never seen before, they're going to have to think about it. They're not going to have a question immediately, or maybe they're not going to want to ask a question immediately. They really need to mull the material over. And I would go back and forth in my lectures. If it looked like someone was not really understanding what I was saying, I would go back and I would try and explain it again, or I would bring the topic up again. Because I remember my first time learning about p-n junctions, and it was in no way a straightforward thing for me to learn about this material. I had a certain element of disbelief when I was learning. When it came to textbooks and reading material, it was a real challenge because there is no good photovoltaic textbook available, and that's really at any level. If you type the word photovoltaic into the Amazon search, you're going to get over 4,000 results. Many of these are going to be irrelevant or duplicate items, which I don't understand how Amazon sorts these things. But a lot of them are just not going to be what you want, and you have to sort through them. There's actually a surprising amount of do-it-yourself PV installation books out there, which I thought was kind of interesting. Prices vary. You can get used books off Amazon, or they can get new books. Many of the books, in fact, most of the books I looked at didn't have good or even any chapter problems. I used the look inside feature a lot on that website, and I learned that you don't go by the star rating. You actually have to look at the textbook. You have to read some of the text to see how it's written, to see if you think it's going to be easy for your students to understand. I looked at about 50 textbooks online, ordered in about half a dozen of them, and whittled it down to two good candidates by actually reading through these books, which made for a really long summer. Um, Neither book that I chose required calculus because I wanted the students to focus on the concept, so that I wanted them to learn about photovoltaics and not the derivations for all these equations that they were going to be seeing. In looking through all this stuff, I did come across some very helpful things. At the basic level, there's a book called Applied Photovoltaics by Stuart Wenham. It's around $52 on Amazon, and it's really a very nice introductory text. It's written for people who don't have a strong background in science or engineering, and it does have exercises at the end of each chapter. The only downside is that it really focuses heavily on silicon technology, so it does have some limited scope. And unfortunately, the pictures or the figures are all black and white. It's which I don't think is always all that helpful. I think if you throw a little color in now and then, it just kind of makes some of these graphs much easier to look at. It covers only the basic scientific concepts, and it covers a little bit of the deployment of solar, but since it only discusses silicon technology, that further limited it. The second resource I have up here is pveducation.org, and this is an excellent website. It has videos and experiments you can run online by changing the numbers. It allows you to change parameters and see what's going to happen to a JV curve. It's really, really helpful when teaching students about PN junctions and how they work, because there's one excellent lesson I used about how the current flows in forward and reverse bias, which really helped my students to really get a handle on it. Again, it mainly focuses on silicon technology, which became kind of a problem when we were talking about the different technologies, because as you know, a silicon or CIGS device is opposite structure as from a cadmium telluride device. So there was a little bit of work there getting the students to understand that we have different structures and why we have different structures and things like that. Again, it focuses mainly on silicon technology, but it's free. Anybody can go online and use it, which really makes it excellent. When it gets to the more intermediate and advanced resources, then there's just really not a whole lot out there. There's no specific intermediate resource for teaching photovoltaics. The Physics of Solar Cells is an excellent book by Jenny Nelson. It's about $50 on Amazon, and it's great if once your students have got the basic concepts and you want to take them to the next level. But unfortunately, it does not have anything about deployment. It's only about the actual science of the solar cells. So it's really limited in that respect. You have to find another source when you want to teach the students about deployment. And when I think about deployment, part of that is when you talk about altitude and angle of incidence of sunlight and how you're going to build your array so that you get the most power out of it without shading for the longest part of the day. And that was pretty interesting to especially a couple of the engineering students in the class. But I think that it's a really good thing to teach students in general and not just stop at the science, but to take them through to the next part of what you're going to do with this thing once you've made it. Now, and when it comes to advanced texts, there's a couple really good ones out there that cover semiconductors. There's the Handbook of Photovoltaic Science and Engineering, which is really a great reference book, but it is $253, which is really, really expensive and very difficult to justify asking a student to buy that. I did make sure that the students had access to it in the library, and I think a couple of them did use it at one point, but those were the graduate students that were in the class and not the undergrads. The Physics of Semiconductor Devices is another really good advanced text. It's $153 on Amazon, so it's something else to consider when you're trying to choose a textbook for your students. It's a great book, but it also doesn't go into many solar applications. I actually took a class as a grad student where the instructor used that as the text, and he gave us problems that were more of what we were seeing in the labs, depending on what we were doing. So it can be used as a textbook, but like I said, there's no problems in it, and it is pretty advanced. One thing to think about also, here's a nice Ferris Bueller's Day Off reference for you, is, you know, what your class means to your students. How are your students reacting to you in the classroom? And you really need to take your cues from your students. As a physics undergrad, I had to take classical mechanics as part of my degree, and the professor who taught the class had a very monotone voice. And, you know, you take a dry subject like classical mechanics and you give it to a professor who talks in a monotone for 40 to 50 minutes, and you have a lot of students who are totally lost. It was very hard to pay attention to him. He never turned and looked at the class, so he didn't know that we weren't paying attention. He would skip large sections of algebra and trigonometry and totally lose us. So needless to say, the first exam was a bloodbath. It didn't take long for us to realize that we were going to have to really work hard in this class to get anything out of it. And nobody wanted to ask him questions because we were to the point of confusion as a group that we didn't know what to ask or how to ask it. So look at your students when you talk to them. That professor very rarely ever looked at us. Are your students awake? And you can ask them questions to see if they are awake. When it came to homework and projects and student presentations, I always encouraged the students to work together. I figured even if just one student was doing the homework and the others were copying, they at least had to pay attention to what they were writing to write it correctly. And it also, I think, gave them a chance to talk to each other and see what each other was bringing from the class. And that actually, by weighting the homework and making it worth part of the class, I think that helped them to get more out of it also. I assigned, like I said, the group project and had each group give a presentation, which some of them were very uncomfortable with, but I made sure that I took students who I could sense were struggling with English as not their first language and put them with students who did have strong English so that they could actually work with each other and learn some presentation skills. And they all did really well. I think it ended up being a really good give and take for them. I made the lectures available online so the students could download them after class, and they could use that as a reference and as a guide when they were doing their homework, because not all of their homework questions had to do with calculations. They had homework questions that were short answer essay. And I emphasized office hours and made sure that students felt comfortable coming to see me during office hours. And I had several students who did regularly come to office hours, and they seemed to get a lot out of the class in general. Um, when it comes to demos and things, sometimes things just go terribly, terribly wrong when you're doing a demo in a class. Um, Sometimes the lecture didn't go as planned. Sometimes the network would go down. The projector broke one day, and I had to just write everything on the whiteboard. Um, there were things that I thought were going to be really cool and interesting that they did not think were interesting at all. And when we came to the project part, I had to insist that they go outside of Wikipedia. They wanted to all use Wikipedia, and I said, no, you have to find other qualified sources. Um, the classroom that I was assigned in Wyoming didn't have any windows, and one day in the winter it just got so hot that I actually canceled class because everybody was just so uncomfortable. I think that classroom had to have been 95 degrees. So, there was just all kinds of things that always go into teaching any class that really went into photovoltaics. And one time I brought in a solar cell and a battery to, where you have the fan attached to the circuit, and you put the light on the solar cell and it makes the fan move. Well, in carrying it from the lab to the classroom, apparently one of the wires got loose and it obviously didn't work. And they just kind of looked at me like, really? You can't expect us to fix this, right? But I think all in all, I just remember to be a little flexible and to make sure that when you're teaching the photovoltaic concepts to your class that you don't make it too difficult, but that you don't make it too easy. Chemists, physicists, and engineers all approach problems differently. And sometimes just talking across different disciplines can be a challenge, but I think that it's something that we all need to do when we are teaching a class. And finally, I think that Benjamin Franklin said it well when he said, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. So if you involve your students in your photovoltaics class, they'll learn about photovoltaics and they'll understand why solar energy is such a great thing. So any questions from anybody at this time?
Hey, Jen, this is John Peck. Thanks so much. I did have a quick question. We are having two teachers come later this summer. We've got a research experience for teachers supplement from NSF. I'll definitely have them take a look at your presentation because they'll be teaching photovoltaics to their students in the future. Did you have any suggestions or ideas that might be helpful for a pre-college, whether it's high school or middle school level student base?
I think that with really young students that don't have a background in materials at all, if you can teach them some rudimentary circuit design and present photovoltaics as a circuit instead of as a p-n junction, I think they will probably be able to learn that a little easier, because I remember learning circuits in high school, and I think that it's something that most high school kids especially can get. Well, younger kids might be a little bit difficult. I don't know. They're the ones that really get the demos. You have the demo that works and they remember that. But there again, I think it depends on how much science they have had, and how much you can keep their interest. You know, the junior high kids are tough.
I'll pass on the message. Here from UT.
Okay.
Hey Jen, it's Doug here. I was wondering, so I mean, we go to these meetings all the time where we're talking about somewhat complex topics or more detail-oriented topics. I can imagine if you're teaching someone who doesn't know the field at all, that you'll hit some pretty big roadblocks on something that, you know, you might think, oh, everyone knows this, but it's not really something that's intuitive to someone who's really new to the field. So I'm wondering, what are some of the big roadblocks that you hit pretty early on where you have to realize, okay, I think we need to take a step back here. Like, where were those sticking points?
I think one of the first sticking points I encountered was when I first started teaching about p-n junctions, and I realized that many of the chemistry students did not have any idea what I was talking about with solid state physics or different carriers, whether they were a positive carrier or a negative carrier. That actually took about a whole day to work through. Originally, that was supposed to be 10 minutes of a hour-and-a-half lecture, and we ended up having an open discussion and talking about it for over an hour of that class to try to get them to, so that I could help them to understand a solid state device. That was a real big hurdle, actually. I think one thing we need to remember, you know, we throw around p-n junctions. We talk about negative and positive carriers all the time because they're so part of our culture. But when you talk to the average person on the street, they know what an electron is, but they have no idea what a hole is. And you have to really, really explain that carefully.
Thanks, Jen.
You're welcome.
Anyone else have other questions? You can either type them into the chat window or feel free to use your microphone. Well, it doesn't sound like we have any other questions, so thanks again, Jen, for taking the time to put this together. Like I said, we're going to have a couple teachers here at UT in about a month who will then be taking their experience back to their students. So I think this will be especially helpful for them, and hopefully some others will find some use out of this as well in the future.
Okay, well, if there's anything else I can do to help you, John, let me know.
Thanks again, Dr. Jennifer Drayton, for your presentation, and we will look forward to having other folks on our Distinguished Lecture Series in the future. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.